You already know how to work hard. That's not the issue. You plan. You stay disciplined. You show up when it would be easier not to. You've built habits, set goals, done the things that are supposed to move the needle. And some of them have. But there's a category of things that hasn't moved. The relationship that keeps stalling at the same point. The opportunity that gets close and then doesn't close. The version of your life you've been building toward that somehow stays just far enough ahead that you can never quite reach it. And the harder you push, the further it seems to get. That's not a motivation problem. It's not a discipline problem. It's not even a strategy problem. It's a forcing problem. And forcing is invisible because it doesn't feel like desperation. It feels like care. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being serious about what matters. You don't recognize it as the problem because it looks exactly like the solution. But the Stoics saw it clearly. Marcus Aurelius watched it play out across an entire empire, in the men around him, and in himself. Seneca traced it to the anxiety of a mind that cannot rest in what it has. Epictetus, who owned nothing and controlled nothing except his own response to the world, understood it most precisely of all, that the grip itself is what destroys the thing being held. This is what they understood that most people never do. The effort isn't the problem. The direction of the effort is. This video is built in two halves. The first half is a diagnosis. It's going to show you exactly what forcing is, where it happens, and what it costs. Not in abstract terms, but in the specific, recognizable ways it shows up in your work, your relationships, and the quiet internal pressure you've probably stopped noticing because it's been there so long it feels normal. The second half is the solution. Not a mindset shift, not a collection of affirmations. A precise, practical understanding of what the Stoics actually did instead, and what that looks like applied to a real day, in real circumstances, with real things at stake. Most people who find Stoic philosophy encounter it as a set of principles. They understand the dichotomy of control. They can explain it clearly. And then life tests them. A deal falls through. A relationship hits turbulence. A plan they've invested months in starts to unravel. And the philosophy doesn't show up. Not because it isn't true. Because understanding a principle and having it available under pressure are two completely different things. This video is about closing that gap. Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations to record his successes. He wrote them in the middle of an empire, surrounded by outcomes he couldn't fully control, to work out, night after night, how to stop fighting what wasn't his to fight. Seneca wrote his letters from inside a life of wealth, exile, and eventual forced death, tracking precisely where his own mind was gripping what it couldn't hold. Epictetus built an entire philosophy from a position of literal enslavement, not despite having no control over his circumstances, but because of it. Because the absence of external control forced him to locate his power somewhere else entirely. What all three arrived at was the same thing. Not passivity, not indifference, not the absence of desire or ambition or effort. A different direction for all of it. That's what this is about. And it begins with something most people never stop to examine. The thing that's been running quietly beneath every act of forcing you've ever done. What it actually is. Where it comes from. And why it's been so difficult to see. Let's start there. Layer 1. What forcing actually is. Before you can stop forcing, you have to see it. And that's harder than it sounds, because forcing doesn't arrive wearing its own name. It doesn't announce itself as desperation, or anxiety, or overreach. It arrives wearing the face of something respectable, something you've been rewarded for your entire life. It arrives looking like diligence, like responsibility, like being the kind of person who takes things seriously, who doesn't leave outcomes to chance, who stays on top of everything that matters. In a culture that prizes control and preparation and relentless follow-through, forcing doesn't feel like a flaw. It feels like a feature. It feels like the reason things get done, which is precisely why it's so difficult to recognize and so costly when it goes unexamined. Here is what forcing actually is, stripped of everything it uses to disguise itself. Forcing is the quiet belief that if you don't manage every variable, things will fall apart. Not the belief that effort matters. Effort does matter, and the Stoics were unambiguous about this. Not the belief that preparation is valuable. It is. But the belief that your job doesn't end at the edge of what you can actually influence. That it extends into the outcome, into the response of other people, into the timing of circumstances, into the shape of events that were never fully yours to determine. Forcing is what happens when effort crosses into territory it was never meant to occupy. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with a precision that still cuts. He distinguished clearly between what is up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our responses, the quality of what we bring to the process, and what is not. Not as a philosophical abstraction, as a daily operational principle, as the line he returned to every morning to re-establish where his energy belonged and where it was being wasted. Epictetus drew the same line more sharply still. He called it the most fundamental division in human life. On one side, everything within your control. On the other, everything outside it. And the suffering, he observed, is never really about what's on the outside. It's about the refusal to accept that the line exists at all. Seneca put it differently. He wrote that the man who fights against what he cannot change doesn't demonstrate strength. He demonstrates confusion about where strength actually lives. All three are pointing at the same thing. Forcing is not a strategy. It is a misunderstanding about the location of your power. And the reason it's so persistent, the reason intelligent, disciplined, self-aware people do it for years without catching it, is that it provides something real, something that feels, in the short term, like security. When you are managing every variable, checking every outcome, staying on top of every thread, there is a feeling of being in control. A feeling that nothing can slip through unnoticed, that you are doing everything you possibly can. That feeling is not nothing, but it is not the same as actually being in control. And over time, the cost of maintaining it, the mental energy, the constant vigilance, the low-grade anxiety that comes from knowing, somewhere beneath the surface, that the control is partly an illusion, begins to accumulate. And what you're left with is not security. It's exhaustion wearing the mask of responsibility. Layer 2. The grip tightens. Here is what most people don't realize about forcing. It doesn't stay where it starts. You begin by forcing one thing, the outcome of a project that matters, the timeline of a goal that's taking longer than it should, the response of a person whose approval feels necessary. It feels contained, a specific tension around a specific thing, manageable, even reasonable given the stakes. But the mind doesn't compartmentalize the way we imagine it does. The habit of gripping, of extending your effort past the boundary of what you can actually control, doesn't stop at the edge of the thing you started gripping. It becomes a way of operating, a default mode that the mind applies not just to work, but to conversations, to relationships, to the internal experience of being yourself. You start forcing outcomes at work. Then you start forcing conversations, steering them, managing them, pre-deciding how they need to land before they've even begun. Then you start forcing relationships, monitoring them for signs of drift, recalibrating constantly. never quite able to trust that they'll hold without your constant management. And then, quietly, you start forcing your own internal state, trying to feel confident before the confidence has arrived, trying to feel calm before the situation has resolved, trying to manufacture certainty in a mind that is responding honestly to genuine uncertainty. And that is where forcing becomes truly costly. Because when you start forcing your own internal state, when the grip turns inward, you are no longer just managing outcomes. You are managing yourself against yourself, spending energy fighting your own honest response to reality instead of moving through it. Marcus Aurelius noticed this pattern in himself with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable to read. He wrote about the mind that creates its own turbulence, not because of what is happening outside it, but because of the resistance it generates to what is happening. The man who cannot accept the texture of a difficult day, who insists internally that things should be different than they are, who fights the present moment because it doesn't match the version he was managing toward. He wasn't describing weakness. He was describing what happens to even a disciplined mind when it loses track of where its jurisdiction ends. The grip tightening isn't a character flaw. It's a logical extension of a flawed premise. The premise that your stability depends on outcomes going a certain way. Once you've accepted that premise, of course the grip tightens. Of course it spreads. Because outcomes are everywhere. And if your stability depends on managing them, the job is never finished. There is always something else to monitor. Always something else that could slip if you relax. The exhaustion that comes from this isn't the exhaustion of doing too much. It's the exhaustion of trying to hold something that was never meant to be held. And beneath the exhaustion, beneath the vigilance and the monitoring and the constant low-grade tension, there is usually something simpler. Something that the grip is protecting. A fear that if you stop managing, if you loosen even slightly, something important will be lost. Something you've worked too hard and too long to risk letting slip now. That fear is real. It deserves to be taken seriously. But it is also exactly what the first half of this video is here to examine. Because the grip that feels like protection is often the thing doing the damage. And seeing that clearly, not as a judgment, but as an honest observation, is the first move the Stoics ask you to make. Layer 3. What you're actually pushing away. The most painful thing about forcing isn't how it feels. It's what it does without you knowing it's doing it. Because forcing doesn't just drain you internally, it broadcasts, it transmits something. A frequency that the people around you pick up without being able to name it. A quality of need, or tension, or pressure that sits just beneath the surface of everything you do. And what it pushes away is precisely what you were trying so hard to secure. Think about the last time you were in the presence of someone who needed something from you. Not someone who asked directly, someone whose need was ambient, who was monitoring your responses for signs of approval, who was managing the conversation toward a particular outcome before it had found its own shape. You probably couldn't have articulated exactly what you were sensing, but you felt it, and something in you pulled back. Not because you didn't like the person, but because the pressure was doing something to the space between you. That is forcing, visible from the outside, and it operates the same way in every domain it enters. In work, forcing looks like the pitch that's slightly too polished, the follow-up that comes one day too early, the proposal that's been revised so many times in pursuit of the perfect version that the original energy has been edited out of it. The outcome that needed to arrive naturally but was pushed, and the pushing was visible to everyone except the person doing it. In relationships, it looks like the connection that was developing at its own pace until someone decided it wasn't developing fast enough and began accelerating it. the friendship that started to feel like an obligation, the partnership that cooled not because the feeling had gone, but because the need to secure the feeling had become louder than the feeling itself. And in your own inner life, in the quality of the work you produce, the ideas you generate, the creativity that either flows or doesn't, forcing is perhaps most destructive of all, because the mind that is gripping cannot also be open. The attention that is monitoring outcomes cannot also be fully present with the process. And it is presence, full, unencumbered presence with what you are actually doing, that produces the best of what you are capable of. Marcus Aurelius understood this not as a philosophical position, but as something he had to actively work against. He wrote about the mind that is scattered across 100 concerns it cannot resolve. Busy everywhere, effective nowhere. The man who is present nowhere because he is managing everything. That scattering is not neutral. It costs you the very thing you were trying to protect. The opportunity doesn't close because you weren't good enough. It closes because the desperation was visible, and desperation changes the dynamic of every room it enters. The relationship doesn't cool because the feeling wasn't real. It cools because need, when it becomes too loud, asks more of the other person than the connection can hold. The work doesn't fall short because you lack the ability. It falls short because the part of you that needed it to succeed was too loud in the room where the work was being made. Forcing doesn't fail quietly. It fails in the exact direction of what mattered most. And the hardest part, the part that makes this genuinely difficult to sit with, is that from the inside, it always felt like the responsible thing. It felt like caring. It felt like showing up fully for what mattered. The very thing that was costing you looked, from where you were standing, like the thing that was holding everything together. That's not a personal failing. That's what happens when effort loses its direction. Layer 4. The root. Control as a substitute for trust. Everything in the first half of this video, the spreading grip, the signals you didn't know you were sending, the things being pushed away by the very effort meant to secure them, all of it has a single root. Not weakness, not lack of discipline, not some fundamental flaw in how you're built. A belief. One belief, so quietly held that most people have never examined it directly. A belief that took shape early, through experiences that rewarded control, through moments where letting go genuinely did lead to loss, through a world that consistently prizes the people who manage everything and questions the ones who don't. The belief is this, that your safety depends on your ability to control what happens next, not your effort, your control. Not the quality of what you bring to a situation, but the outcome the situation produces. Not what you do, but what results. And because outcomes are what you've been measuring yourself against, outcomes are where your stability has been quietly stored. Which means every time an outcome is uncertain, every time the result is outside your reach, some part of you is unsafe. Some part of you is already bracing, already gripping, already doing the work of forcing before you've even consciously decided to. This is why forcing feels involuntary. Because in a sense, it is. It's not a decision, it's a response. The automatic movement of a mind that has learned, over years of reinforcement, that control is what keeps things intact. That the moment you stop managing, the moment you release the grip even slightly, something important will slip. And here is what makes this so difficult to address. That belief isn't entirely wrong. There have been moments in your life where letting go did lead to loss, where the thing you stopped monitoring did slip, where the outcome you stopped managing did go in the wrong direction. The belief wasn't formed from nothing. It was formed from evidence, which is why it feels reasonable, which is why, When someone tells you to simply trust the process, something in you resists because you have specific memories of what happened the last time you trusted and the thing you trusted didn't hold. The Stoics didn't ask you to pretend those memories aren't real. What they asked, what Marcus Aurelius asked himself night after night in the Meditations, is a more precise question. Not whether control ever works, but whether the control you're exercising is actually over anything that belongs to you. Because there are two kinds of control, and most people never separate them. There is the control of conduct, the quality of your effort, the integrity of your process, the consistency of how you show up. This is entirely yours. No circumstance can remove it. No outcome can retroactively diminish it. When you act with full integrity and the result doesn't arrive, the conduct remains. It is not canceled by the outcome. It stands on its own. And then there is the control of outcome, the result, the response, the timing, the way things land in the hands of circumstances and other people and forces that were never fully yours to direct. This was never in your possession. Not really. What felt like control over outcomes was always, at best, influence. At worst, it was the illusion of control, maintained at enormous cost, providing the feeling of safety without the substance of it. Forcing happens when you treat the second kind as if it were the first. When you extend your effort past the boundary of your conduct and into the territory of the outcome, trying to manage what was never manageable, trying to secure what was never securable, you don't gain safety. You lose it. Because now your stability is stored in something that fluctuates, something that can be taken, something that will, at some point, not arrive the way you needed it to. Epictetus was unambiguous about this. He said the root of all human suffering is the attempt to control what is not ours to control. Not difficulty, not loss, not hardship. The attempt to control what cannot be controlled. Because that attempt never ends. There is always more to manage, always more that could slip, always more that requires the grip to tighten just a little further. The diagnosis ends here, not with a solution yet, but with a clear view of what has actually been happening. The effort was real. The care was real. The desire to protect what matters was real. What wasn't accurate was the belief that control over outcomes was ever where the protection actually lived. That belief can be replaced, not with passivity, not with indifference, with something more precise, more honest, and, as what follows will show, considerably more effective. If the first half of this landed somewhere real, if something in the diagnosis felt uncomfortably familiar, stay with it. Subscribe, because what comes next isn't more of the same. It moves from what's been happening to what to actually do instead. And if you know someone who works hard and still can't figure out why the things that matter most keep slipping, send this to them. Not as advice, as a gift. Layer 5. The shift from control to conduct. The diagnosis is complete. You've seen what forcing is, where it comes from, and what it quietly costs. And if any of that landed with recognition rather than surprise, if it felt less like new information and more like something you already knew but hadn't yet named, then what follows is what you've actually been looking for. Not a philosophy to admire from a distance. Not a set of principles that make sense in the quiet and dissolve under pressure. A practical shift in where you direct your effort, specific enough that you can feel the difference between the old way and the new one, and clear enough that you can begin making that shift today. It starts with a distinction that sounds simple and isn't. The distinction between controlling outcomes and conducting yourself. Most people, when they hear the Stoic idea of focusing only on what you can control, hear it as an instruction to care less, to want less, to lower the stakes of their own life so that disappointment becomes less likely. That reading is not just wrong, it's the opposite of what the Stoics were describing. Marcus Aurelius did not govern the largest empire in the world by caring less. Epictetus did not become one of history's most influential teachers by lowering his standards. Seneca did not produce some of the most precise moral writing in human history by reducing his investment in the outcome. They cared deeply, but they cared in a different direction. Conduct is everything you bring to the process, the quality of your attention, the integrity of your effort, the consistency of how you show up in the work, in the relationship, in the moment where it would be easier to drift than to stay present. Conduct is entirely yours. No circumstance can remove it. No outcome can retroactively diminish it. When you act with full integrity and the result doesn't arrive, the conduct remains. It is not canceled by the outcome. It stands on its own. Outcome is what the world does with your conduct. It is real. It matters. But it is shaped by variables that were never fully in your possession. The timing of circumstances, the responses of other people, the 1,000 factors that intersect with your effort in ways you cannot predict or fully manage. The shift the Stoics are asking for is not from caring to not caring. It is from storing your stability in the outcome to storing it in the conduct. That shift is not passive. If anything, it demands more of you, not less. Because when you are no longer using the outcome as a measuring stick for your worth, the conduct has to be the thing. The quality of what you bring has to be genuine, because it's no longer a means to an end. It is the end. It is where the value of what you do actually lives. Marcus Aurelius returned to this every single day of his reign, not as a reminder to relax, as a reminder of where his power actually was, to direct his full attention and effort toward what he could genuinely influence, his judgments, his decisions, his responses, the example he set, and to release, with clarity and without resistance, everything that sat outside that boundary. Not because the outcomes didn't matter, because he had learned, through years of governing what couldn't be governed, that the stability he needed to do his job well could not be stored in outcomes. It had to come from somewhere that outcomes couldn't reach. That place is conduct. And the moment you locate your stability there, genuinely, not just intellectually, something changes in how you move. The desperation that was broadcasting underneath everything you did begins to quiet. Not because you've stopped wanting the result, but because your sense of being okay is no longer contingent on it arriving. And that quiet changes everything around you. Layer 6. Letting the process lead. There is a version of engagement that most people have experienced at least once. Maybe in work, a project that absorbed you so completely that the question of whether it was going well stopped mattering because you were too fully inside it to be measuring it. Maybe in a conversation that found its own momentum, where you stopped managing how it was landing and simply followed where it was going. Maybe in a physical effort, a run, a training session, a period of manual work, where the mind stopped calculating and the body simply moved. You know what that feels like. And you probably noticed, afterward, that the output from those periods was different. The work was better. The conversation went somewhere it wouldn't have gone if you'd been steering it. The effort produced something that the calculating, monitoring, outcome-checking version of you rarely produces. That is not an accident. That is what happens when the process is allowed to lead. What most people don't realize is that this state isn't luck. It isn't reserved for moments when the stakes are low enough that you can afford to stop gripping. It is a direct consequence of where your attention is placed. When your attention is on the outcome, measuring, monitoring, checking whether the result is forming correctly, a portion of it is always somewhere other than the work itself. Always in the future. Always in the gap between where you are and where you need to be. But when your attention is fully on the process, on this sentence, this conversation, this decision, this moment of effort, something different becomes available. Not just better output, though the output does improve. A different quality of presence, a mind that is actually here, doing the thing, rather than hovering above it and evaluating it in real time. Seneca wrote about this with a directness that is difficult to argue with. He observed that most people do not live in their own lives. They drift through them, always somewhere ahead of the present moment, managing a future that hasn't arrived while missing the only moment where anything can actually be done. The present, he wrote, is where power lives. Not as a philosophical preference, as a practical fact. And letting the process lead is how you return to it. This doesn't mean abandoning standards. It doesn't mean releasing the commitment to quality or the desire for a good outcome. It means placing your attention where it can actually do something, on the action in front of you, rather than on the result, which is downstream of the action and cannot be directly touched. The relationship that was being forced doesn't need management. It needs presence. The work that was being gripped doesn't need more revision. It needs more genuine attention to what it is trying to become. The goal that kept slipping doesn't need a tighter grip. It needs a cleaner, less pressured engagement with the daily process that leads toward it. When you stop forcing and let the process lead, the first thing you notice is not a dramatic shift, it's a quieting. The background noise, the constant low-level monitoring, the checking, the measuring, begins to reduce. Not all at once, gradually, but the space it occupied becomes available for something else. For the actual work, for the actual conversation, for the actual version of what you're building, which was always better than the version you were trying to force into existence. Marcus Aurelius described this as the natural state of a mind that has returned to its own jurisdiction. Not a mind that has given up, a mind that has stopped fighting outside its own borders, and in doing so, has become fully available for the territory that was always its own. That availability is not a retreat. It is where your best work comes from. Layer 7. The paradox resolved. There is a paradox at the center of everything this video has been building toward. And it needs to be named directly, because if it isn't, everything built so far remains incomplete. You can understand the diagnosis. You can accept the shift from outcome to conduct. You can begin letting the process lead, and still be left with a question that the previous layers haven't fully answered. If I stop forcing, if I release the grip, redirect my effort, stop managing outcomes, does that mean I get less? It's a fair question. It deserves a direct answer. No. In most cases, you get more, but not through any mechanism that resembles the one you've been using. And understanding why requires looking honestly at what forcing has actually been producing. Not in terms of effort, but in terms of signal. Every interaction you have transmits something. Every piece of work you put into the world carries a frequency. Every conversation, every pitch, every relationship you enter communicates something beyond the words and the actions. Something about the internal state from which all of it is coming. And people read that internal state with a precision that bypasses conscious analysis. They don't think about it. They feel it in the quality of the attention you bring. In whether your presence feels open or pressured, in whether being around you feels like an invitation or an obligation. Forcing transmits need, and need, at a certain volume, changes the dynamic of every room it enters. Not because the people around you are indifferent to what you want, but because need, ambient, unspoken, broadcast through the texture of everything you do, creates a pressure that people instinctively move away from. Not consciously, not unkindly. The way a room feels different when someone in it is desperate, even if nothing has been said. Even if everyone is behaving perfectly well. The desperation is in the air, and the air changes. Conduct without forcing transmits something different. It transmits sufficiency, a quality of presence that says, not in words, but in everything beneath the words, that this interaction is complete in itself, that you are here fully, without an agenda that depends on a particular outcome, that the quality of what you are bringing doesn't fluctuate based on whether the result arrives. That is an entirely different frequency, and it produces an entirely different response. Marcus Aurelius understood this not as a social strategy, but as the natural consequence of a mind operating from the right place. A man who has located his stability in his own conduct rather than in external validation doesn't need the room to respond in a particular way. And paradoxically, because he doesn't need it, the room responds differently. Not always, not as a guarantee, but with a consistency that cannot be manufactured by the forcing it replaces. This is not mysticism. It is the straightforward mechanics of how human beings read each other and how the quality of work emerges from the quality of the attention that made it. The opportunity that kept slipping wasn't slipping because you weren't good enough. In many cases, it was slipping because the need for it to arrive was visible. And visible need changes the terms of every negotiation, every collaboration, every creative act. Remove the need, not by wanting less, but by storing your stability somewhere the outcome can't reach, and the terms change. The relationship that kept stalling wasn't stalling because the feeling wasn't real. It was stalling because the pressure to secure the feeling was louder than the feeling itself. Quiet the pressure, not by caring less, but by letting the connection develop at the pace it actually develops, and something that was contracting begins to open. The work that kept falling short of what you knew it could be wasn't falling short because you lacked the ability. It was falling short because the part of you that needed it to succeed was crowding out the part of you that knew how to make it good. Release the outcome, not by abandoning your standards, but by placing your full attention on the process that produces them, and the work finds its own level. That level is almost always higher than the one forcing could reach. Not because you tried less, because you were finally fully present for what you were doing. Layer 8. How to actually practice. This everything in this video has been moving toward one question, not what is forcing or where it comes from, or what it costs. Those have been answered. The question that remains is the one that determines whether any of this changes anything. What do you actually do differently tomorrow morning? The Stoics were not philosophers who left their insights at the level of principle. Marcus Aurelius didn't just understand the dichotomy of control, he built a daily practice around it, a set of moves returned to consistently that kept the philosophy operational rather than merely admired. The meditations are not a record of conclusions, they are a record of practice, of a man doing the daily work of returning to what he knew because he understood that knowing without practicing is the same as not knowing. What follows are 3 moves, not techniques grafted onto your existing way of operating. Extensions of everything that came before, ways of making the shift from outcome to conduct real, repeatable, and available under pressure. The first is the morning check, before the day begins, before the inbox, before the schedule, before the weight of everything that needs to happen starts pressing. You ask one question. Not what do I need to achieve today, but where am I already gripping something that isn't mine to control? Specifically, not in the abstract. The conversation you've been pre-managing in your head, rehearsing different versions of, trying to steer toward a particular outcome before it's even happened. The relationship you've been monitoring for signs of drift. The project whose result you've been checking against a timeline that exists only in your own expectations. The goal you've been measuring your worth against every day, it doesn't arrive. Name them, not to catastrophize, but to see them clearly before the day gives them power. Because a grip you can see is a grip you can choose to loosen. A grip you can't see is one that runs the day without your permission. Marcus Aurelius began every morning this way, not with optimism or affirmation, with honest preparation, with the deliberate act of locating, before anything had happened, where his effort belonged and where it was likely to stray. The second move is the mid-moment notice. This one is harder because it happens in real time, in the middle of the meeting, the conversation, the creative session, the moment where something isn't going the way you needed it to go, and the grip instinctively tightens. The notice is simple. A single internal question. Ask the moment you feel the tightening. Is this mine to manage or mine to release? Not a lengthy deliberation, just the question. Because the question creates the pause. And the pause, as everything in this video has been pointing toward, is where choice lives. The tightening is automatic. The notice interrupts the automatic. And in that interruption, you have something you didn't have before. The option to direct your effort back toward your conduct, rather than outward toward the outcome. You don't always take it. Some days the grip wins. That is not failure. That is the practice being honest about how difficult it actually is. But over time, the notice becomes faster. The pause becomes more available. And the choice, made repeatedly in small moments, begins to reshape how the larger moments go. The third move is the evening audit. Not a review of outcomes, a review of conduct. At the end of the day, before the habit of unconscious reflection takes over, before the mind starts its own unstructured replay of everything that went wrong, you ask 3 questions. Did I direct my effort toward what was genuinely mine to influence? Where did I stray into territory that wasn't mine, trying to manage what couldn't be managed, control what couldn't be controlled? And what would more aligned conduct have looked like in those moments? Not to punish what happened, but to move with more precision tomorrow. This is what Marcus Aurelius was doing in the Meditations. Not recording victories, not constructing a legacy. Sitting at the end of the day, with the gap between the person he intended to be and the person he had actually been. And using that gap not as a source of judgment, but as a source of direction. A small, specific adjustment. One movement toward more alignment than yesterday. Repeated nightly, that movement accumulates, not dramatically, not in a way that produces sudden, visible change, but in the way that all real change happens. Quietly, beneath the surface, in the daily return to what you know and the gradual closing of the distance between knowing it and living it. These 3 moves don't require a transformation before you can begin them. They require only that you start. Tomorrow morning, before the day takes over, one question. Where am I already gripping something that isn't mine? That question, asked honestly, is already the shift. Everything else follows from there. You came into this video believing, on some level, that the answer was more effort, more discipline, more management of the variables that kept producing the wrong results, more of the thing that had always worked before, applied harder, applied longer, applied with enough force that eventually the outcome would have no choice but to arrive. That belief wasn't wrong because you were trying too hard. It was wrong because it was pointed in the wrong direction. The Stoics didn't arrive at their philosophy because they were indifferent to outcomes or unambitious about their lives. Marcus Aurelius wanted the empire to hold. Seneca wanted to live well and think clearly and leave something worth leaving. Epictetus wanted, from inside circumstances that would have broken most people, to be free. They wanted things, real things, things that mattered, but they located their power somewhere that outcomes couldn't reach, in the quality of the effort, in the integrity of the conduct, in the daily, private, unspectacular work of showing up fully for the process, and releasing, with clarity rather than resignation, everything that sat outside the boundary of what was genuinely theirs. That is not a smaller life, it is a steadier one, a life in which your sense of being okay doesn't rise and fall with every result, in which the work you produce comes from a mind that is fully present rather than constantly measuring, in which the things you want have room to arrive because you've stopped filling that room with the pressure of needing them to. The shift isn't from effort to ease, it's from effort pointed outward, at outcomes, at results, at the responses of a world you cannot fully control, to effort pointed inward, at conduct, at presence, at the one place where your power has always actually lived. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Not comfort, not relief. Strength. The specific, quiet, unshakable kind that doesn't depend on anything outside you to remain intact. That strength was always available. You were just looking for it in the wrong place. The work doesn't stop when the video does. The direction you found here continues, and your next step is already waiting on your screen.